Thanks so much, Davis. My position is technically Director of Privacy and Compliance at New York Public Library, but it's really more an emphasis on privacy. As far as I know, I'm the only full-time privacy director at any library in the country, so NYPL was kind of on the forefront about 5 years ago in hiring somebody to do this kind of work. Now it's in the forefront of every company, and so I feel like we've been able to get a head start. But working with good people like Erin and Davis, I can see that libraries across the country are either eagerly doing this, sometimes I think better even than NYPL is doing. So my hats off to people who are really interested in this work. So just a quick refresher, what's privacy? I mean, that's always worth just re-emphasizing the definition. Any information that can identify you. Doesn't always have to be your name or address, but a piece of information that can tie back to the person. An example I always like to give is, this is a few years ago, a woman was standing on a bridge in New York City about to commit suicide. The only piece of information she had on her was her NYPL card, and the police knew that they could identify this person by that card. It was an exigent circumstance, but we were able to help the police identify her based on just that one identifying factor. So that's the important thing to know. What is it that can tie back to you? PII, it's a term hopefully everybody knows, but personally identifiable information. That again gets to the idea of what are these nuggets of data, of information that can tie back to you. We all know credit cards, but it could be something as simple as an IP address. It could be your date of birth and your mother's maiden name. Think of the things that are often used to authenticate you. And the reason this is important is in doing these privacy audits, which we're going to talk about, it's important to know what pieces of information are essential to know that your library is capturing. So I always start off when I talk to the teams at NYPL about the data life cycle, because this is, in my mind, this is the core of what privacy audits are about. You have to, first of all, understand what it is you're collecting from patrons. Could be through a paper form, could be through a web form, could be somebody coming to an event and just telling the person their name or signing a register. You're also going to store it somewhere, right? It's going to be located, if it's paper, it might be in a file cabinet. We all still have a lot of that, but it might be in a spreadsheet, might be in a database, might be in a third-party database, which we'll talk about in a second. You also have to provide access. Let's take the filing cabinet example. Somebody is going to have the key to that file cabinet, and you're going to have minimally one or more people who have access to the data. Transmission is an interesting aspect of it. This is where data doesn't always live exactly in one place. In the old analog world, think of paper call slips. That was an example of where that record pretty much lived in one place at one time. Now, with digital information, it can be replicated in a microsecond and transmitted to 1,000 other people in an instant. So the replication and transmission of data is another important element. Retention period. I think libraries, not across the board, but I know at NYPL, it's not always been instinctual practice to decide how long you're going to keep information once you collect it. I mean, we all, hopefully we all don't keep borrowing records, because that's a key element of how libraries operate. But for other things, you might want to keep, say, the names of people who participated in an educational program or story time program. You might want to be able to contact them later. Donors, for instance, that's a good category. How long do you keep that information? And if you do have a limit, how is it disposed of? So that completes the data life cycle. I mentioned third-party vendors. They come in many flavors. Ebooks being a key one that almost every library uses in some way. ILS system, integrated library systems such as Sierra. our third-party realities that every library faces. How do each of these systems use that data lifecycle? When you think about it, an ILS is collecting, storing, etc., that information in its own system. You as a librarian may have access to it, but somebody else is in receipt and storage of that. So what we did at NYPL was I reached out to every single department and said, we're going to do this data inventory, and we're going to try to collect the information that represents that full circle, that full life cycle. This is the data inventory. We translated this into a spreadsheet, which I'm going to share with everybody. For Davis, I think, is going to provide links. But essentially what we wanted to know is, obviously, who's in charge of it, what you're calling it, give it a unique name. Is it paper or electronic, which acknowledges the fact that a lot of our information is still analog. Where does it come from? Is it from a patron? Is it from another system in the library? And which personal elements are obtained? Is it the name, the address? All of these things should be spelled out. And how is it used by your department? Is it used just for record-keeping purposes? Is it used because you may later want to reach out to the patron? Is it necessary? So here's an example. Sometimes we, for an event, will collect a person's phone number or their home library, because we have 88 branches. Is it necessary to have that information in each and every case, or is it a nice to have? And as we've gone through this with the folks at NYPL, I try to emphasize to people that think about whether you really need that piece of information from a patron, or whether we're just kind of, casting this very fine net and gathering up as much information as we can. Do we ever aggregate the data is another question. So we have the whole strategic development department that uses this for analysis to keep track of, obviously, how many people are borrowing books, but we might want to know how many people from a particular branch are borrowing books. Where is the information collected? So obviously there are many places. Google Drive, interestingly, has become a favorite for those who have the Google Enterprise application. Spreadsheets, Word documents, and where are those stored? If they're stored in local drives, are they stored on network drives, and how are they protected? What other departments have access to the data, and which people? What third-party systems? So this goes back to third-party vendors that I mentioned. An example of this might be, we use Eventbrite for registering or signing up for events. So Eventbrite obviously has access to that data. It's our data. We try to put that under our contracts, and that's a whole other discussion that we've had about contracts with third-party vendors. But how does that data get collected and used by the vendor? Here's a key one. Is consent obtained from the data subject? We've all seen the little check boxes that are pre-checked that says, do you want to receive newsletters? The question is, has the patron really opted in for this? Have we received consent? In Europe, there's a notion of opt-in rather than opt-out. And that's, as libraries, I think we should try to steer toward that path, making sure that we don't collect anything that the patron doesn't want collected, which leads to the next thing. Can they opt out? Can they say later on, you know what, I really don't want you to keep my my home address or my phone number. I want you to delete that from your system. Or here's one we're starting to get a lot of, and I'd be curious to know if other libraries have seen this. There's a service called Saymine, S-A-Y-M-I-N-E. You can go to this site, plug in your email address, and it will tell you every entity it can find, scraping across the internet, who has your information. And with a few more clicks of the button, you can ask any of those entities to delete your information. So we're starting to get requests from people, delete all of my information from NYPL. I know that you have my email address, and I don't want you to have that information anymore. We write back to the person and say, if you truly want this to happen, just be aware that your library account is going to be deleted and you're not going to be able to borrow books. So sometimes people through these automated systems ask for something that is going to have a negative effect. How long do we retain the data? And then is it disposed of? So those are kind of the key elements that we use in our data inventory. And Erin's going to talk more about the privacy audit. And once you know these pieces of information, what do you do with that? How do you make sure that people are following the proper procedures? So if people are not, for instance, if they're not disposing of the data in a timely way, how do you prompt them to do that? One last thing that I'll mention is this PII matrix. This is also a document that I'll share with everyone, but it's from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and it's an attempt to say not all PII is as sensitive as other PII, and it actually ranks it in the sort of high, medium, and low categories to help you really zone in on the things that are the most sensitive data. Biometric information, certainly. Things like mother's maiden name, things that could be used to compromise your account somewhere, or to use it in a way that you had not given permission for. So let me stop there. I know I'm kind of at the end of my time, and I'll turn it over to Erin if she's ready.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin Berman. I'm the division director for our learning group, which is kind of our equity division over at Alameda County Library. I'm also sitting in as my third year as chair of ALA's privacy subcommittee, or a subcommittee of the Intellectual Freedom Committee. And I'm going to talk to you about kind of another portion of privacy audits that you can do. So the data inventory, I feel like, is one portion. You need to understand what data you have out there, where it is, how long you're keeping it, all of the things that Bill touched on. But there's another tool that you can kind of utilize in your arsenal to be able to conduct a full audit and really be in the best practices of our libraries. So we're going to talk about using ALA's privacy guidelines and checklists, and these are really our industry standards that will help you get started in meeting the different the different standards that we set out as a industry. Okay, so the privacy guidelines were actually created by LIDA, IFC, and the Privacy Subcommittee. And they were created as a way to assist libraries in adjusting your operations to meet best practices. So you can see they cover a wide range of areas. And we're actually have been adding more to these through the Privacy Subcommittee. It's our charge to keep these updated and to add new content to them. So currently, the guidelines that we have are around assistive technology, vendors, data exchange between network devices and services, library websites, OPACs, and discovery services, and library management systems, and also students in K through 12 schools. So assistive technology and vendors is actually new. We just added those this last year. The vendors one, it used to just be around like ebooks and ebook vendors, and we decided that wasn't actually broad enough. So we've actually rewritten that guideline to not just be guidelines for libraries, but also guidelines for vendors. So ensuring, we know there's a lot of conflict and misalignment between vendors' privacy practices and libraries. In talking with a lot of vendors, they actually have no idea that privacy is even a core value of libraries or anything about what privacy means in libraries. So we are creating this with the idea that this would be a tool for them as well. So this is, you can see an example of the guidelines. You can find them on ALA's website. So they really give you this high-level overview of best practices, but that's not really enough because it doesn't tell you how to make it happen. I think these are really good whenever you're talking to stakeholders or you're trying to find different metrics around privacy and security, but they're not really very good in telling you how to actually implement these different things at your library. So that's where the checklists come in. So this is how you actually put those guidelines into action. So all of the guidelines have their corresponding checklists. And I should say all, but because those two, the vendors and the assistive technologies, are brand new, we haven't finished developing those checklists yet, but they'll be ready by the end of the year. So they're getting close. So earlier I was mentioning that, it doesn't really matter what size library you are. And we, in writing these checklists, really understood there is a vast difference between a small rural library and NYTL. And expecting all libraries to be able to do the things that NYTL can do is just not really realistic. And so we set different priority sections. So the priority 1 actions were made with this hope that, like, these are the gold standards. Like, if you're any type of library, you should really work hard to make sure you're meeting these priorities. Priority 2 are for libraries. We think a lot of libraries can meet them, but you'll probably need to have, access to an IT department who's actually talking to you. We know that doesn't exist everywhere. And priority 3 are libraries with larger infrastructures. But you can see they're all really like, do this thing, take this action, and you can check them off of your list as you're moving through. Okay, so now you've got these guidelines, you've got these checklists, like how do you use them in the process of an audit? So I actually ran a privacy audit at San Jose, and it took us about 1.5 years to actually really run the audit. So we did something very similar to what Bill did with each of the departments, which is we went in and we asked them, what data are you collecting? Where are you collecting it? Do you need to collect it? And do that kind of data lifecycle chart. But then we also said, okay, let's try to meet all 3 levels of the priorities checklist. And so we determined that. We actually built this tracking tool, and Davis has put the links in there if you want to open up and actually see how we utilize the checklist into this. So we put this into a spreadsheet and we said, okay, which department is responsible for this checklist item? And then we had each of the departments, so the manager for web looked in and said, okay, here's this checklist item. Does it need work? Have we accomplished it already? Or do we feel like this is a thing that we should not be doing? And some of the level 3 items are more optional, right? And so we had everybody go down and run through these and be able to determine what needed to be done. We then, from that step forward, we actually had people dig in and set dates for when they were going to do different things. And so by the end of the process, we knew that either we were in compliance with all of ALA's checklist items, or we had a plan to get there. And we knew when it was going to happen. So it's all well and good. You do this. It was actually a really interesting process because over the course of 1.5 years, we started talking with staff more and more. Every time we had a meeting, we were talking about privacy, and it just became part of the cultural language. I knew that we had really made that switch in people's head when I had frontline librarians emailing me privacy policies from some of our vendors and asking, like, is this okay? Should we be working with this vendor? I'm really concerned about this. Totally not like just on their own volition. People are stepping forward. And you really kind of use this process to dig into all of this and talk about privacy and learn about how we can educate and train people. So it was a kind of fun overall process. So I think it's great to do the audit, but you also need to be transparent and open. You've got to, like I said, create that buy-in. This is not a one and done process. The first time you do the audit is the most complicated, right? And because you're going through all those checklist items, you're determining where everything is, you're creating these big spreadsheets of where data lives, what's going on with it, and you're digging in. But if you do that work up front, and you create the system where you're sharing, you have the data out, then the next time you do it, when you revisit it next year, you can pull up these spreadsheets, you can pull up your audit stories, and you can refer back to it and say, okay, did we meet this goal? Where are we now? As opposed to starting from scratch. It's an iterative process and ongoing. So this is an example of what we did at San Jose with our privacy audit. And not only were we transparent and open with our staff, but we also published all of this on our website. So you can actually go there now, and you can go to the privacy audit. You can run through and see each of those different areas where what's going on. So you can see in this one what information was collected. If you go to the IT page, you can actually see them listing if they met any of the checklist requirements, and if not, when they were planning on doing so. So I personally believe the more open and transparent we are with our public, with our staff, the better we are for it. So in addition to that, we also put on our website, we went through every single one of our vendors and we looked at what their authentication mechanism is. Do they send PII to the library, and what data they collect on anybody? And I think this is really important. I have gotten messages from members of the public who literally thought that anything they click on the library is the library. They don't understand this complicated nature of us buying services from other people. Some do, but a lot of them just think it's all the library. And so when you are doing business with these third-party vendors, we have to be transparent and have to let people know what's happening, because without being informed, they can't make a choice as to whether or not they want to participate in that data collection. Also, we put on there this data breach response, that people knew what would happen and that we had a plan. So we built that in as part of the audit. One of the checklist items was ensuring that we had this data breach response, and we didn't have that. And so making sure that we had all this stuff by the end, going through all those checklist items allows you to ensure that you have this really robust privacy and security infrastructure. Another really great example of a library who's done something similar is from the Santa Cruz Public Library, and Davis has posted that link in there as well. They have a really good example, and if you look up their GitHub repository, they actually have shared that code, and so you can do something similar at your library as well. So I think my kind of last thing is just this. So, because I really do think everybody can do it. I really do strongly believe that it doesn't matter how small you are. It doesn't matter how much power you have in the library. You don't have to be a person in administration. You know, even doing audits around your personal sphere can make a difference. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not an all or nothing. You know, I'm a big proponent of harm reduction, and that's I think what we should all be going for, is to do as much as you can, and that makes a difference.
Thank you both so much. So much information shared in just like 25 minutes, which is amazing. So thank you again for attending. Thank you so much, Bill and Erin. Always a pleasure. I always learn so much. You make these topics so concrete and accessible, and I think that's super needed when we live in such a confusing world of data floating around everywhere. So thank you for that. And I hope to be in touch with you soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Erin. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.